Last week we kind of left off, kind of getting into Ruth, the book of Ruth, and I wanted to really get into her tonight and look at her life. And we're going to look primarily at the first chapter of Ruth because this really gives us a great example of what our faith can produce. And, of course, we've been talking about faith and how our faith needs to be demonstrated. It needs to be active in order for it to even be faith. Faith can't just stand on its own without action taking place. And we've looked at a lot of scripture regarding that. Ruth is probably one of the most telling books of just the impact that faith can make, and primarily with what happened to Ruth. And I want to get into what her background was tonight, and that's why I want to stay in chapter 1 and have us hopefully understand just really how pivotal that was, but just how significant it is when someone is in your life who, or if you being in someone else's life, can show their faith and how strong your relationship with God is, just how that can rub off and impact other people. We always, when you look at Ruth, how many in here have studied Ruth with a Bible class or on your own or whatever? We've probably read the book. Some have gone through probably maybe a more extensive study of her life, and she is the main character, isn't she? I mean, she's, you see how her life kind of transitioned and how she traveled with Naomi and her sister Orpah. They lost their husbands, and and what happens to her by the very end with marrying Boaz. And so, this whole book is about her. What I really want to focus in on tonight is Naomi, because we see her really active in this first chapter. And there's a reason why Ruth becomes as faithful as she is. And that is because of other faithful people in her life. And so it's, it really is hopefully it's a great encouragement that, we can, the most unlikely people with the most unlikely background can sometimes, turn their life around and be one of the most instrumental people for God. And that's what happened because of Naomi. But as we start out, they're kind of looking at it. It's interesting when you look at the life of Ruth and who she is in the lineage of Christ, and and some of the other women as well. When you look at Christ with his line, there are in the lineage of Christ. There's two harlots. Does anyone know who they are? Rahab is one. Remember who the other one is? Tamar. You've got Rahab and Tamar, two harlots in the lineage of Christ. You've got one idolatrous Moabite who is Ruth. That was her background. And you have an adulteress as well. Who is the adulteress? Say it again. Bathsheba. So it's interesting when you start looking at all these different figures, and wasn't just the women. We see different men as well in the lineage, but it just shows us that God can literally use anyone for his purpose, and that your past is not so sordid that God can't use you. And when you look at Ruth, this is a great example of this, this whole thought process right here. Turn to Ruth chapter 1. And we can go ahead and begin with looking at this. And then I want to show you some slides up here to really kind of put this into perspective. But Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, this is talking about how, a man named Elimelech and his family, they traveled to Moab. And it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his two sons. And so there's this famine. And the name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion, the Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab, and they remained there. So here they have this famine. They travel to Moab because, they hear that's where, where there's going to be plenty of what they need. They travel from Bethlehem, Judah to Moab is about 50 miles. And so if you can imagine traveling, they didn't have cars back then, so it was quite a trip going about 50 miles. And the word Bethlehem means house of bread. And, they're traveling here, and that's where they said, okay, this is where, we're going to be able to find things where we're going to be going to, because of this famine. And so Elimelech makes this decision to take his family to Moab because of the family, or because of the famine. And so Moab is a really interesting place when you start to look at it. You look at verse 3, it says, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. So here she comes to Moab to find it. So she's in a completely foreign place. Anyone know what kind of a place Moab was? Say that again. Idolatrous. So you've got Naomi with her husband, who are Jews. We can assume that they're faithful Jews based on the rest of what we see in the book of Ruth. But they're coming to Moab. Moab, so they're going right into the lion's den right here of all of this idolatry, this paganism. You know what kind of paganism it was? All right, I want to show you something. There's a couple of slides here. Let me see if I can turn it on. All right. This was the common worship of Moab. This is what Naomi and Ruth and her sister Orpah would have been a part of in going to Moab. But her son marries these when they come into the city. When you look at verse 3 and 4, we can catch ourselves up to speed here. Verse 3, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. She was left and she had her 2 sons. But then you get to verse 4 and it says, they took wives of the women of Moab. And the name of one was Orpah and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. So they were there for a whole decade in this idolatrous place. Her sons find these women, and they marry these women in Moab. And then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and so the women survived her 2 sons and her husband. But here's what really is here's what we really want to kind of zero in on, is realizing what kind of a background Ruth and Orpah would have had at this time. So Naomi comes, there's a famine, her husband takes her, husband dies, her 2 sons, they find these women, Ruth and Orpah, they marry them, and then they die. But what we need to consider is what kind of a background and upbringing Ruth would have had. Because we always look at Ruth and she's always described as chaste, isn't she? As just being this really faithful, chaste woman. She's pure, but it wasn't always like that. Moab was a sadistic place. We're not just talking about idolatry. We're not just talking about making these statues like we saw in Canaan and, all of a sudden creating some personality for them and believing, well, they might be over over fertility, or they might be over the weather, or they might be over how successful we are with our finances, whatever the case might be. This was a really sadistic kind of worship. And what they would do is build this gold calf. Now, in Moab, it was called Chemosh. In other parts, it was called Molech. And I'm going to switch to this right here. Okay. This is a map of where they would have been. This is the Valley of Hinnom right here. We're going to get to that in just a few minutes here. And then you see the kingdom of Moab, which is where they would have traveled right there. So all up in here, that's the Red Sea. All going up here, they're practicing this really vile, despicable form of Molech or Chemosh worship. What they would do is build Molech or Chemosh, whatever you call it, depending on where you are. He's a brass, he's made out of brass, and it's the calf that has his hands stretched out in front of him. And what they would do is sacrifice their children. They would get this down below, and in this artist rendering, there would have been like a basin. And in the basin, they would put the coals and wood, everything to make this just completely searing hot all over. And if you've ever touched brass when it's been hot, you know how hot it really can get. and said they would let this heat up, and they would put their children in the hands of this and let their children literally char them to death. Which is really interesting, because when you look at how God hates the shedding of innocent blood, this is what they practiced, and this was the regular worship. This is what Ruth and Orpah would have seen this all the time going on, because this was the regular worship that was happening among these pagans. And you think, just how could anyone do this to their child? What's interesting, and I think I probably mentioned this before, there are some people that tie this to abortion and saying this is just like abortion with this. It's not exactly like that, and here's why. When they would sacrifice their child, they thought of this God as so high up and so powerful and so great that they would give, they wanted to give the absolute most valuable thing that they possibly could to this God. They sacrificed. There was nothing that was worth more to them than their own offspring. And when they would give their offspring to this God, it was like saying, here is the very best of what I have. This child. And they would literally char this infant child to them. I want to just a little bit to get into it, because this is not the only place that followed Molech and Chemosh worship, okay? As we mentioned, we've got the Valley of Hinnom right here, and then going down into the other part so the Valley of Hinnom would have been right around here. You've got the Kingdom of Moab right here, and so all up and down here, you've got this Molech or Chemosh worship. And so it's spread pretty far and wide with how they would do it. But it was one of the most morbid periods of any of Israel's history that was involved in, with this kind of pagan stuff. Look over at, keep your place in Ruth. Look over at Psalm chapter 106. Because we really get kind of an indication from different parts of Scripture of just how, just what kind of environment Ruth would have grown up in and what she would have seen constantly and the kind of impact that it must have had on her. When you look at, turned to the wrong one. I want to get to Kings. Okay. Psalm 106, verse 34 through 40. And if someone wants to read that.
They did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them, but they mingled with the nations and learned their practices. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons, and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with the blood. Thus they became unclean in their practices, and they put the harlot in their deeds.
Okay. So he's talking about these, all of these sadistic pagan worshipers that would sacrifice their own children. They spilled the blood of their own children. I mean, I can't imagine what that must have been to watch. And this was the regular practice. This was the regular worship of that day, or in that place. In 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4 through 7. And if someone wants to get that when you get there.
For when Solomon was old, his wife turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidon, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the
Ammonites.
Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not follow the Lord fully as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for
Chemosh,
the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Moloch, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon.
Okay. So we have Solomon, who got so wrapped up in these wives of his that, and it was warned of him not to do this. Of course, Solomon followed after all these women that were unauthorized for him to even be with, and they said, don't go after these women. But these were idolatrous, paganistic women, and they turned the head of Solomon. I mean, what was Solomon known for in his day? It was wisdom, wasn't it? He was known as the wisest man of his time. And yet he gets wrapped up with these unauthorized relationships, and they turn him from God, turn him to this idolatry, and he even built a high place. In other words, an area specifically set out to worship Chemosh. It says the abomination of Moab. And so you see this, this image of Molech or Chemosh, this hollow brass statue that was placed just south of Jerusalem, along, in this valley. And then there's also one down in, Chemosh was also built down in Moab as well. Josephus describes the idol as being inside 7 chapels, and a worshiper must give a certain kind of offering to enter each one. Only those who offered a son made it to the 7th chapel. And so part of this, of sacrificing their own children, was to try to get further and further and further into this chapel so they could be known to who they believed, Chemosh believed, they would have this personal relationship with him, going as far as they could. And so, in killing their children, they would be able to, it's just. But that's what they were taught. That's what they believed growing up. That's what they would have been. That's what Ruth would have been seeing all the time in her upbringing. And we don't have any indication in Scripture of if she condoned this or if she was against this. But being a Moabite, that was the everyday practice. That was what you would have seen all the time. In Jeremiah 7:31, this is really, the first time I ever studied this really got to me. I mean, it gets to me every time I study it. But it's not just enough that you would see this taking place. And there's a reason I want to really kind of go through all of this to build this up so we understand just how significant this transition was. Jeremiah 7:31. Someone want to read that? Okay. I want to explain a couple of these places. The place of Tophet and then the Valley of Hinnom. Both of these things have a translation to them. I want to read what the Encyclopedia of Biblical, Theological, and Ecclesiastical Literature say about it. According to them, it was called the place of Tophet and the Valley of Hinnom because they used to make a noise with drums that the father might not hear the cry of his child and have pity upon him and return to him. We studied quite a bit of this when I was back in school. Essentially, it's exactly how it sounds. What would happen is they would, when they would put their child onto this searing hot, this bowl or the Chemosh, the child would obviously start screaming. Well, in order to muffle the sound, they would start beating these drums so that they couldn't hear the cries of their own child. And that's why they called it. That was the whole interpretation of what Tophet and Hinnom was. Hinnom would eventually be called the Valley of the Slaughtered, I believe, and rightfully so. I mean, there was a reason for it. And so you think, how could anyone be a part of a religion that would do something like this that was so heinous? Hinnom, it says, because the baby wailed and the noise of his wailing went up. And so Moab was notorious for their cult worship of this god, this false god Chemosh. The Moabites were called the people of Chemosh, as well as his sons and his daughters. That's how much they were influenced by the whole belief system of this. That's what Ruth was a part of for much of her life, until she meets Naomi and her sons. And so when you start to understand, as she goes along with Naomi and her sons, what an impact that must have been to have her turn around like she did. And that's why I want to, when you start looking at the life of Naomi, and when we start looking at our own lives of just what faith really can do and the impact that it can have, you think of what Naomi drug Ruth and Orpah out of when she, when her son, first off, when her sons would meet her, and then when Naomi, when they befriended her as well. And so you have, these wives that, or the sons of Naomi that took the wives of the women of Moab, verse 4, Orpah and Ruth, and they dwelled there about a decade. And we get to verse 5, and it says, Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. The woman was left of her 2 sons and her husbands. And so here you have 3 deaths in the first 5 books. In fact, when you look at this in Scripture, this is really probably one of the most depressing openings of any book of the Bible. This was, I don't know of another book that starts out with, these, one dies. Her husband dies. Then her sons die after they marry. And so all the women are alone and kind of looking out for each other. But it is a sad time for Naomi.
Well, not only that, but they only came to this strange place because they were going to starve to death if they didn't. So they moved here so they could actually, provide for their family and, feed each other. And then she lost her husband and both of her kids.
What a time for her, isn't it? For Naomi. And so that's a good point. That's not even why they weren't planning on spending a lot of time here. They came here for one reason. And she ended up losing, most of her family. You get to verse 6, and it says, Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. And if you look, as we look through verse 6 through 15, we're going to see the farewells that Naomi begins to give. She wants to, along the way, she and Ruth and Orpah, they sort of build this close relationship. And it's interesting, when you look at the situation, the circumstances, that's how a lot of these relationships, even get built today, aren't they? Someone who has lost a loved one knows what, they may not understand the full extent of what someone else might go through, but they do understand, the hurt and the pain, that there is hurt and pain involved with it. And, when you see a widow, they will very often befriend other widows because they've been through it together. They know what, they get hurt and everything. And so you've got not only that, but now you've got Naomi with her daughters-in-law who've gone through the same thing she did. And it says, Wherefore she went, verse 7, out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah. Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, Go and return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and me. The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. And then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice, and they wept. And so, both are planning to go with her. She, in the meantime, says, it's okay if you leave. She wants that, she understands this, this is not the life that I know you chose. And she's asking them if they want to go. But, and then you get to verse 10, though, and you see how they said to her, Surely we will return with thee unto thy people. And Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? She said, I don't have any other children. I don't have any other sons that, that you can marry. You don't have to stay with me. You can go and find a family. And, you see this term, my daughter, repeated throughout the book of Ruth. And so she was very close to Ruth and Orpah. And they were very close to her. Verse 12, she begs them again, turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband also tonight, and should also bear sons. As I said, she's too old to have a husband. She's not, her days are over in her eyes of having having someone in her life. He says, would you tarry for them until they were grown? Would you stay for them? from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. So she tells them that they're young. They have their whole lives ahead of them. They don't need to take care of her. I mean, you think of just how selfless Naomi is right here, in looking, and putting them even above, in front of her.
I don't think she's telling them that they don't need to take care of her. I think she's telling them that she cannot take care of them because the tradition would be the next son would marry the widow.
Right, but she tells them that she can't have anymore.
Right, and so she's trying to make it very clear to them that's not going to happen.
And she's beckoning them to, there's nothing more that she can provide for them. I mean, her assessment of this is that, the hand of the Lord was brought against her. You'll see that in verse 21. And so, here's a bitter and broken woman in Naomi. I mean, think of just how hard this must have hit her. And you think of how hard it must have hit Ruth and how hard it must have hit Naomi. And so we've got these three widows right here. And it really captures it says in verse 14, they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave to her. And it really captures the emotion of all of them. And so this is sort of the relationship that has been brought about. And so imagine Naomi, this Jewish, this faithful Jewish lady, is here with Ruth and Orpah, who have this background that's completely different than Naomi. I mean, they were the ones that saw, all of these horrible, horrible things happen, with their upbringing. And through her sons and her, there was a change somewhere along the line. I mean, how amazing that is, when you start to have faithful people in your life. Verse 15, she said, behold, thy sister-in-law has gone back unto her people and unto her gods. So by this time, through all of this, talk, through all these different conversations, Orpah finally decides to go back. It says, thy sister-in-law has gone back unto her people and unto her gods. So all of these different people and all of the gods that they had worshipped, Orpah decides, I'm going to go back. She's not going to be with them anymore. She's going to go back to the people. It says she's going to go back to her gods, meaning what? What was the life that was before the one she had with Naomi? I mean, she's going back to try to, whether she's going to try to find someone. And so, you think, some people think, well, is that really the best advice? Is, Naomi to send her back to, return to a land of idolatry? But it wasn't Naomi, was it?
I sometimes wonder if this is a warning to Ruth that not only is she going back to her familiar family that just easier way of life, but also to this false god that even if she over time it's very likely that she would return back to a previous belief system, whatever her family is practicing.
Possibly. I mean, Ruth knew what the lifestyle was. She understood it. And she knew how sadistic it was. That's why I don't understand why, how could Orpah go back to something like that, knowing what was taking place? But it wasn't the same for Ruth. What does she say? Verse 16. Entreat me not to leave you or turn back from going, for wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and what? Isn't that amazing? Somewhere, at some point, Naomi and her sons, they started to influence her, didn't they? You think of a woman who had that kind of a background religiously, who you probably saw these children being, this was just how it was. This is what Moab was. And these were public displays when they would do this. And so all the people would be there to see all of these things happen. And here's Ruth, who comes from this Moabite background, being a part of all this paganism, being part of all this killing and slaughtering of these innocent children, hearing those drums beat while the children cry, and here, later in her life, she meets the son of Naomi, and along the way, she renounces idolatry to embrace the one true God. I mean, that is amazing when you start to think about it. I mean, when you start to look at how impactful we can be, and that is what faith is able to do. We hear a lot about Ruth. We don't hear a lot about Naomi, but Naomi and her son were the ones that pulled her out of this. This is what faith does. When we can start showing the faith, and that's why when looking at how faith has to be demonstrated and looking at how faith has to be active, you start looking at the influence that you can be. The whole thing of this, of the series that we're doing right now is faith, hope, and love. Faith can lead to that hope, and it will, if someone's open to it. There's that hope. What is hope? They're just saying, well, I hope I go to heaven. I hope I do this. What is hope when you look at it, as it's connected to faith? Because faith is that strong persuasion of God. What is hope? It's a promise. It's the assurance of what God will do. That's what it can lead to. That's what happened right here. We're seeing that. We're seeing Naomi's faith. And we don't have a lot of information about her children, but we know that Naomi was faithful. And you see just what kind of an influence she was to someone like Ruth. Pulling her out of this lifestyle, pulling her out of this religious system, and going so far as Ruth, this Moabite idolatrous woman, to turn and say something like she did, "Your God will be my God." And that is, when your faith is built and your faith is operating, and just to really start putting it into practice and care about people, you're going to see changes made with it. Verse 17, she says, "Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried, and the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." She wants to be buried with her mother-in-law. Man, that is just, you think of just the whole transition that she makes through this whole thing. And it's because of Naomi caring enough about her, Naomi staying with her, being that example to her, and then Ruth doesn't, she knows when she has a good thing. She sees that. And she's so serious that she wants the Lord to strike her down if something other than death parts them. I mean, she and Naomi really built a bond. How many in here have seen someone come to Christ? How many have had a hand in someone coming to Christ? Whether it's a study, whether it's just a discussion, whether it's just planting a seed. How strong is your relationship when that happens? It's amazing just how some of them, you don't always stay in touch, but there are some relationships that just, you've got a strong, faithful friend for life many times when that happens. And you see that right here. You see verse 19? Now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem, and it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And so they come back to where they came from, and they are welcomed right back into everyone. And as you get into Ruth chapter 2 and following, it is just, you really start to see Ruth's faith grow at that. But when she says, your God will be my God, it is a really pivotal moment in her life. And it's a great moment that you see of just what can happen when your faith is demonstrated like it is. That's why as we go through and keep looking at all these different ways of people seeing your good works. I mean, think of the conversations that Naomi must have had with her. Think of the conversations that her sons may have had. We don't have a lot of record of all the dialogue, but something was said to keep Ruth interested, wasn't it? Something was said that was so powerful and so compelling to her that she didn't want to go back to that Moabite way. She didn't want to go back to the idolatry. She didn't want to go back to the sacrificing of the children. She didn't want to go back to all of the, while Orpah went back to all the gods, Ruth said, no, I want your God to be my God. She turned from being polytheistic to monotheistic, to understanding the one God that could do more than anything else. That's the importance of our influence. And so as we take this and start looking at it in all these different ways, okay, now we don't need that. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We're just about done here for tonight. We can start to understand the importance of our influence. And then think of what Naomi must have felt when she saw, when Ruth said what she did to her. So I'm going to read 1 Corinthians 11:1. Okay, who's speaking right here? Or who was writing? Paul. Who's he talking to? The Corinthian church. What was the Corinthian church like? Idolaters. There was division, right? They had a lot of problems, didn't they? In fact, a lot of people will compare Corinth of that day to a place like Las Vegas. There was a lot of sin that was happening in Corinth. But Paul writes this letter to them, and he tells them, imitate me just as I also, don't imitate me just because of who I am. Don't imitate me because of the things I've done, because we know what Paul was capable of doing. He says, imitate me at this point just as I also imitate Christ. What can happen when, what were the results of that? Imitating Paul. When he tells them, imitate me, just as I imitate Christ. What was Paul like? What was his characteristic by this time? Okay. He was a servant. He was faithful. I mean, everywhere he went, he would always give Christ the glory, wouldn't he? And he's saying, you imitate me just as I imitate Christ. That was Paul's faith. That's who he was in looking at this. He writes a letter to the Thessalonians. I can see it. Look at 1 Thessalonians 1:6. Someone read that when you get to it. Okay, you became imitators. What version is that? ESV. Okay, that's what it is. Anyone have another word there? Followers. He says, you became followers or imitators of us and the Lord, having received the word in much affliction. In other words, you received, we gave you this word. You took this word and you started following or imitating what we did according to what this word was, giving the authority to this word with joy of the Holy Spirit. And so you start to see what Paul and the other apostles, the influence and the impact that they had on all of these different people, all of these places that Paul went, the individuals that he met, the churches that were set up, started following him, and his influence, his faith was significant in all the, in converting people to Christ. That's the influence that we can have. Someone read Hebrews 13:7.
Remember those who led you, who spoke the word of God to you, and considering the results of their conduct, imitate their faith.
Okay. Those who have led you or have ruled over you, who have spoken the word of God to you, whose faith follow or imitate, according to ESV, considering the outcome of their conduct. And you start to see just really what faith can do to a relationship. When someone sees who you are, and when someone sees what your faith is and how important and how active it is. Could stuff like this happen, by the way, if I just had a faith-only mindset? How is someone going to imitate me if I can't show them something to imitate? If I just say, well, I have faith and that's it, you don't need anything else, well then, how do you imitate me just as I imitate Christ? If I don't think I have to do anything in order to show this faith. Paul said you became, in 1 Thessalonians 1:6, you became followers or imitators of us and the Lord, having received the word in much affliction. Hebrews 13:7, remember those who rule over you, who have spoken the word of God to you, whose faith follow or imitate, considering the outcome of their conduct. That's not going to happen if if something's not connected with that faith, if that faith isn't being demonstrated in some way. Philippians 3:17 and 18, we'll end it here tonight.
Brethren, join us in following my example, and observe those who walk according to the pattern you have in us. For many walk, of whom I often told you, and now tell you even weeping, that they are enemies of the cross of Christ.
Okay. Brethren, join in following my example and note those who walk. Pay attention to those who walk as you have us for a pattern. See, there's going to be a lot of people in and out of their religious lives, weren't there? But he says if you follow the pattern, because there is a pattern when you start looking at Scripture. There is a pattern when you start looking at conduct with this and with faith. He says, note those who so walk, as you have us for a pattern. For many walk, in whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ. Those enemies are going to influence somebody as well, aren't they? They did that a lot. But he says, join in following my example, and note those who so walk, as you have us for a pattern. Because he knew what the apostles were capable of doing and showing. You think of what you as a Christian in following the Word of God and what that's capable of doing. Because someone is going to watch you follow the pattern of the Scriptures. Someone's going to notice. Someone's going to be affected by it. Remember we said last week, how many things does it take to completely break someone's trust or the impact that we might have on them? It takes one thing, doesn't it? We don't follow it, or they see us make a decision that is completely contrary to what the Bible is. But they see you try, and they see you do everything that you can to follow the pattern of Scripture. Think of what that can do for other people. We saw it work with Ruth. We saw Ruth pulled out of a lifestyle that many people today would never even think that she was capable of. There's a lot of people today that think, well, someone's in some religious mindset, especially a cultic background like she had, and they think she's hopeless. You can't influence her. She's so brainwashed that how are you going to get her away from something like that? But we saw it happen, didn't we? because that's the power of what faith is capable of doing. Next week, we'll look more at this and then start looking at a lot of the positive influences that we really can have with this faith. And then we're going to look at after this, before these people get in here, after we start looking at the influences, we're going to switch gears, and we're going to start doing a series on the fruit of the Spirit, and what the fruit of the Spirit is in the New Testament and what that entails.